with that, I'd really love to get ourselves started. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. It's so nice to see many familiar names and faces on this call today. I hope that everyone had a lovely Mother's Day yesterday. Ascend at the Aspen Institute is delighted to host this conversation about care and extend the Mother's Day celebration into the work week so that we can recognize our colleagues who are moms in the paid workforce and also honor the unpaid labor of moms of all forms who provide full-time care for their children. My name is Marjorie Sims, and I am honored to be the managing director of Ascend. We work with a community of partners to reimagine leadership and create a future where all families flourish. Through our Ascend Fellowship, we bring together over 140 diverse leaders across sectors with different lived experiences who share a spirit of radical collaboration to transform systems impacting the vitality and wellness of families with low incomes. And in partnership with more than 150 nonprofit organizations in our Ascend network, we co-create new ways to unlock social and financial capital so that families may achieve their goals. I've been at Ascend for almost 10 years, and it is my longest tenure in a role. And I love to say every single day that I am honored and privileged to work with the Coalition of the Willing. One of those leaders we are grateful to count among the Ascend network is Josephine, or Josie Kalipeni. Josie is the executive director of Family Values at Work. Family Values at Work is a movement network of grassroots organizers and coalitions in more than 24 states that is winning paid family leave and paid sick and safe days at the state level, and they have a deep commitment to winning equitable paid leave at the federal level. Since becoming executive director in 2021, Josie has worked to center those who are most impacted and who understand how we get to an economy that works for everyone. Josie believes that the key to achieving Family Values at Work's mission is undoing racist and toxic cultural norms and narratives of individualism, scarcity, and the deserving. Josie has nearly 2 decades of experience in policy, organizing, campaign development, and strategic development. Josie, thank you so much for your leadership, and I am thrilled to have you guide this conversation today. I'm also pleased to introduce Elissa Strauss, the author of When You Care, The Unexpected Magic of Caring for Others. Elissa is a journalist and writer who has covered the politics and culture of parenting and caregiving for more than 15 years. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Glamour, Elle, Allure, The American Prospect, and elsewhere. Thank you so much, Elissa, for your incredible work in writing this timely and necessary book. Her book has led me to reflect upon the care I have received, the care that I've been blessed to give, and the conditions which lead our society to undervalue care. Her book weaves historical anecdotes and science with conversations with parents and caregivers. Care is a long ignored and unremunerated force in our society. And to put it bluntly, none of us would be here on this call without it. Today, we get a chance to have a conversation about the rich, transformative, and complex experiences of care. Care can be a unifying force for us in a way we relate to and connect with our friends, colleagues, families, and strangers. And with that, I will now turn it over to Josie to begin our conversation. And Josie, thank you once again.
Marjorie, thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you to Ascend at the Aspen Institute for hosting us. It is so exciting to be in this conversation with you all and with Elissa. I am just so excited about the book. It's been my travel and walking companion for the past few weeks. It's just incredible. So I can't wait to dive in. I also just want to say thank you because I've been saying for a while, like I feel like I haven't gotten into reading for a while, reading books that aren't policy heavy, that aren't just so, just so deeply work related. And while it is work related for me, it felt different, like different reading. So thank you for calling me back to the bookstores and to reading. So yeah, I'm really excited about this conversation. Elissa,
Thank you. Yeah,
yeah.
me
So
too.
first,
Yeah.
first I just want to say, how are you? And how are Augie and Levi? I know they're the partial inspirations for this book. So I just wanted to check and see, how are you? How's this ride been on book tour?
Yeah, I'd say in this very present moment, how we are is hopefully lice-free because that was the unexpected Mother's Day present that Levi seemed to share with all of us yesterday. But otherwise, it's been wonderful. It's been a lot of time away from them and missing them, but also appreciating getting to get out there and talk about my experience of mothering, of care in kind of serious cultural and intellectual circles, which it's not always welcome in, right? We see care as kind of a footnote or sentimental or just this tough thing no one wants to hear about. And rarely do we get to really dig in. So it's been a real gift.
I'm so happy to hear that. I can't wait to dig into the book and to hear about how things are going on the book tour. But definitely sending love to Augie and Levi and fingers crossed for a lice-free home
Yes, right.
environment. The caregiving doesn't stop whether or not you're on the road, huh?
It really doesn't. It really doesn't. Yeah.
Alyssa, we can literally start on page one of your book. I had to read page one over and over. Like I couldn't even get past page one when I first started the book. On page one, you say caregiving gets in women's way. Break this down for me. First, in the real equity and economic disruptive ways, that you talk really deeply and beautifully about in the book, but then in ways that also happen culturally. So yeah, break that down for me.
Yeah. And, this book came from two places and they seemed very different to me until I realized in both of those arenas, I wasn't valuing care. So, in one place that this book came from was writing about all the ways economically, politically, professionally, care holds women back. And care holds women back because our workplaces deny the reality of care.
Yep.
Care holds women back because we don't value care economically. I mean, you can go broke from caring.
Yes.
It's just this tragic reality that's in our lives. And if you're a sandwich caregiver, really good luck.
Yeah.
So we wonder why care has a bad rap these days. But if you're in a position where you have to pick between your mortgage and care, like it's not going to be easy.
Yeah.
Uh, so it's been years writing article after article of, why we don't have universal paid leave, why don't we have universal affordable childcare and elder care, all the things that we've all been beating this drum for so long. And, I reached a point where I felt like I couldn't write it again. I'd start seeing people quoted saying the same thing I had in an article 5 years before. And listen, that fight needs to continue. I'm by no means suggesting we give up, but I felt like there was something else deeper going on, a cultural roots to this crisis, and felt just so frustrated, right? Like, I think about how care, if we counted it, would be worth as much as the retail sector of our GDP. We don't count it, so we don't see it. I think about how moms who want to run for office can't use campaign funds for childcare, except like, how else are they supposed to make it happen? So all those things were so frustrating to me. The other track that led me to this book was realizing that I didn't value care in my own life. And by that I mean that when I had a kid in Brooklyn, and I live in Oakland, California, but I had Augie in Brooklyn, there was something, and I think it still lingers, there's something kind of uncool about liking motherhood. There's motherhood sentimental, and therefore, if you want to be edgy or serious and, be considered a artist that people wanted to hear from and had something to say, you had to kind of leave the mother side of yourself aside. So
Yeah.
I try to do that. And as any of us who have cared know, you can't really just like keep that part of your life partitioned from everything else. But I tried and tried, and then actually found I was not enjoying motherhood by trying to keep it separate, and enjoyed it much more once I fully let it in to my kind of spiritual self, intellectual self, philosophical self. And I had this aha moment where it's like, I'm sitting there, I'm talking about how our society doesn't value care,
Yeah.
but here I was not valuing care.
Yeah. Yeah, I really loved the conversation in chapter 1, sort of about how, if particularly if you're really committed to social justice work, it's a call for a holistic experience in care and in caregiving. And yet there is this sort of fight of being like, I'm not going to sacrifice who I am in this arena because of caregiving. And even in our own internal unlearnings that we have to do, we have to really pull that apart. And so I really giggled a little bit, but also resonated with me about this sort of like identity crisis that you were talking about in chapter 1. But it's so true. And I have to admit, at first I really struggled with this book, Elissa. Like the idea, our movement really does set up care and caregiving as a challenge, as a burden. And for sure, it is. The numbers prove that, the economic disruptions prove that, the work disruptions prove that. And the health and economic outcomes of primarily women and primarily women of color who are caregivers proves that. And yet there is this sort of like joy and magic, and I call it glitter because it's like,
I love it.
you see it sometimes and sometimes you don't see it because you're in the thick of it. And your book just offers this profound reframing of care that I've heard. There's a group of Black women that I talk to that often say, how do we also interject a narrative of joy around care and caregiving without that meaning that we don't need the things that we actually need? And so this profound reframing of care, that there can be joy in care and caregiving, and that care is good for everyone and everything. This is not how our movements talk of care. And this goes beyond valuing care, as you outlined in the book. It requires our cultural posture toward care to be different. Can you say more about this and what brought you to this?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'll say it's a tricky part of the book because I absolutely don't want to undermine that we live in a society that makes life beyond impossible for caregivers.
Yeah.
At the same time, I feel like when we allow that to be the only narrative, we diminish care. We diminish the kind of deep human, enriching, challenging, but enriching experience of care. And how do we balance both of them? And I don't want us to have figured it all out, but I'm kind of, I created an offering to kind of open up space to start working through this. And how do we rise up care culturally? So when we try to fight for those policies, care is not seen as this like simple transactional thing that, right, again, kind of happens on the side while real life is everywhere else, but right in there in the mix of real life.
Yeah.
I think for me, I felt surprised by how much care pushed me, like really pushed me as a person. There's the love and joy. There's just like the snuggles, Levi and I wake up before everyone else, and every morning I hear him, walk down the hall and get in bed with me. Like that's just the best. But there's also caring for my kids has created a mirror to myself like nothing else has, of seeing my blind spots. I've learned through care that I think I've gotten better, but I could be overly certain. Slightly, in part a product of being an opinion writer for so long, especially during the 2010s when I was very in fashion and journalism, the hot take era. Being someone who every day had to pitch, my editor 6 ideas of like sharp opinions I would then generate over the course of a single day and feel really sure that I was right. And then I have these kids, they're asking me questions, and I was like, wait, what do I know as much as I think I know? The level, we talk a lot about, attention now in our culture, how we have fractured attention for a number of reasons. Care is a way to cultivate deep attention. Care, and we talk about all these things that we're supposed to do to get out there and realize truths about ourselves and realize the hard things about the nature of life itself. And, whether that's, going away on a meditation retreat or hiking some tall mountain by yourself or all these other epiphany seeking experiences that for a long time were kind of mythologized in American culture, were generally done by white men.
Yeah.
And all could be hard, right? Like hiking Mount Everest is not easy. I'm sure it wasn't easy for Henry David Thoreau to spend all that time in the cabin alone in the woods. But we don't dismiss them because they're hard. We're like, yes, those are like meaning-making experiences. And I think when we elevate care like that, I hope that the need to support it, to see how rich it is for shaping us as humans, how it's really the birthplace of morality, that we see like, all right, this is something that is so big, we need to support it. We can't ignore it.
Yeah, I love the idea of care and caregiving as the birthplace of morality. Like I mean, it really does come down to how we value and treat each other and how we make space for that, how we make space to do that, how we make space to interact with people. I really, really love that concept. And you're right in that doesn't diminish the challenges. It doesn't diminish the fact that we're doing care and caregiving in an infrastructure that does not support it, that expects us to work like we don't have families and take care of our families like we don't have to work. And so it really is challenging, but the framework you offer really gives us a runway to talk about care and caregiving as a public good, which is how we have to talk about it. It is good for everyone. It's good for the children. It's good for, elders. It's good for, everyone that we're caring about. And it's good for the economy, and it's good for workplaces, and it's good for developing compassion, which are all these are all like these are all things we want in people we interact with, in people we work with, in our communities. So it really, I mean, that reframing that feels so hard sometimes just feels like such a robust invitation into an abundant way of looking at care and caregiving. So I was so grateful for that and so challenged by it also. And so the other thing that I thought really stood out to me was, um, I think it's around page 136, you talk about how dignity is the minimum that we can offer one another to communicate that a person's particular life is worth something. Um, why do you think dignity is any part of this conversation? Why is it important? And how do you imagine it to show up in the work we need to do to win meaningful care support in this country?
Yeah. So I think dignity as an abstract concept, as this kind of fundamental principle of human rights, which is something everyone's on board with abstractly. Uh, if we really think of like what is the brick from which the building of dignity is built, it's care.
Mm,
It's a dyad, it's one human caring for another human.
mm,
That's what dignity comes down to. And so often in our conversations about, ethics, morality, right, human rights,
yeah.
we speak in this big picture way, and we forget that at the end of the day, all this is happening between two people, and that's the care. And there's a gorgeous story in my book. I don't want to. I will put my however well I wrote it or didn't write it aside. It is a gorgeous story about chosen family,
Mm,
a younger man named Joseph, and an older man named Rich,
yes.
who became close. They met at a retreat for gay men. Joseph was unemployed at the time. Rich was a bit of a hoarder, had a lot of books and religious iconography around the house. And so Joseph came over. He hired Joseph to come over and help clean his house. And through this, they became friends. With time, they were the first people that they revealed to one another that they were HIV positive. Just vulnerability begat vulnerability. And towards the end of Rich's life, he had some serious health problems. He had gangrene, he had a leg amputated, and Joseph was the only person there to care for him. And when eventually Rich dies, Joseph's not really allowed to be part of it in any legal way because he's chosen family. He's not allowed to be in the hospital room. He doesn't have rights over what happens with burials. It's very traumatizing for Joseph because he was his primary caregiver at the end. But what I, really took away from learning about Joseph's story is, a lot of how we talk about care is in this instrumental sense, particularly with children. It's like we're contributing to society by investing in this person and allowing their capabilities to shine. And that can also be the case with elder care. Maybe someone can't drive anymore, but they still can contribute to society. So if you drive them to church, they can help make a meal for for a community meal. But sometimes care really is just about dignity, and like it was in Joseph and Rich's case. And sometimes it was about Rich towards the end of his life just needed one human to give that to him. And I think it's an important part to remember with dignity. I mean, with care. Yeah.
Yeah. How do you imagine the need to emphasize or it's rather like the role of emphasizing dignity in how we think about policy and the changes that we need to make that make care and caregiving more dignified? How do you imagine that interplay between dignity and policy?
Yeah, I hope that we can connect the dots between our relational selves and our broader ethical selves. And, I think it's so easy to pay lip service to these broad ideals. But when you don't invest in care, like you're not actually committed to those broad ideals. We want healthy families, and we want robust community. Like that again, that comes down to care. Like you can't get away from that. And I think there's so many examples of people liking, thinking big picture, either personally. I remember when I first and early in my career, I worked with the labor movement, and I was, a little idealistic and innocent. And I was so surprised when I'd see people that were out there fighting for workers' rights be rude to workers. It was really shocking to me. And as like we're working on a campaign for security guards, but you were just so rude to that security guard right there, or fast food workers. But why did you yell at the Starbucks barista because it was taking too long? And so for me, the dots are connected here, right? It's like we can't just think big picture. We can't have these abstract principles. It's all lip service unless we remember our relationships, and we remember that moral self, to me, actually, like is is the kind of most purely realized in relationships, not in our commitment to big picture ideals. And then we got to get policy wise, we got to get that in the heads of policymakers. Remember, there's relationships at stake here.
Yes, yes. I think that's so important because policy conversations feel like they almost always start with what's possible within law and policy and what's possible within what we can afford and pay for. And if lawmakers and policymakers and decision makers would just take a step back and consider this concept of relationships and dignity and how deeply care is part of the moral fabric of our neighborhoods and our communities and of our country, I do think that the conversation would be different and sound different, and hopefully the outcomes would be different too.
Right. And I think we connect the dots between the loneliness crisis and the care crisis. various health crises and the care crisis. Like when you see care's fundamental, essential role in society, you see how when you don't invest with care, when you don't make good care possible, you're letting down society in so many ways. You're not just letting down the recipient of care or the caregiver. It's the whole fabric's frayed.
Yeah, that's so true. And actually, one of the questions in the chat is, do you think the pandemic changed the visibility of care in the workplace? And have you seen hopeful examples of support to caregivers that also work? I have lots of thoughts on this, but I'm curious about your thoughts first.
Yeah, it's a yes and no answer. Absolutely yes for the laptop class. I think that the visibility of care could not be denied during the pandemic. And I think it was, it was kind of like the big reveal. I mean, like we didn't know people had families and children and unpredictable dependent beings in their lives, but literally putting them in the shot, like in the screen was kind of a big reveal. And I've definitely heard anecdotally and also seen research that suggests that, from that moment in the pandemic, it led to a more ability to be transparent about needs, whether you're a mom or caregiver in the workplace, more flexibility. But again, it's something that I've only either heard anecdotally or seen research on happening in the laptop class and people who can, work from anywhere, as long as they have that laptop and a wireless connection. I have not heard of it, and I would love to be wrong. I have not heard anecdotally nor seen any research suggesting that people who have to go to work have had it any better since the pandemic. I am still hearing, tons of stories of, people have unpredictable scheduling, last minute scheduling, which makes life absolutely impossible for caregivers. Or nor am I hearing any increased generosity and benefits for those outside the laptop class. Whereas for the laptop class, I do hear about benefits to entice parents and other caregivers to the workplace.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the thing that comes to mind for me is the realization that care was so visible during the pandemic that actually the federal government did all of the things that we've been asking them to do for multiple decades. I mean, multiple decades. They invested a scaled, somewhat scaled amount of money into the childcare infrastructure. The federal government passed the first ever national paid leave program. The federal government ensured increased wages and hazard pay for workers in the care sector, and increased protections to workers, and increased hazard equipment and materials. The things that workers need were actually provided by the government at the federal level. These things we've been fighting for 3, 4, 5, 6 decades on end. During the pandemic, the federal government passed all of that legislation, invested the money into it to make it possible. And so I am reminded in this question that we've done it, we've seen it. And to go back to the idea of care and dignity and the profound need for it to be seen as a public good, the fact that all of those benefits expired because all of a sudden the pandemic was over.
Right. And it's like over too,
Is
right?
exactly. The
Yeah.
pandemic is over in
Yeah.
quotes, and yet the caregiving pandemic is not over. And all of those benefits that were federally funded, passed through federal legislation, happened under our watch, happened under our demand, happened in a moment of a pandemic crisis, expired at the complete oblivious dismissal of the fact that many of us are still living in a caregiving crisis. And so we've seen it, and we've seen the impacts on childhood poverty. We've seen the impacts on economic mobility for families with low incomes. We've seen the impacts on increased economic engagement for workers who are able to access leave, increased health outcomes for people who could actually take time off from work to seek medical care. We've seen the impacts and support. So to me, like we should hold that, and we should hold our elected officials accountable to the fact that we've done this. We did it. It didn't cause, it's not what caused economic collapse. It was actually a response to economic collapse. And so, there are things that we can do that can happen through policy that work and that came out of the pandemic, and the pandemic proved it.
Yeah, and I'd like to add that research from the Bureau of Economics suggests, in fact, that not only did all the domestic labor, the care happening inside our homes during the pandemic, not only did it not cause the economic collapse, it prevented it. That was actually a buffer, and we've kind of famously never counted care in the GDP. But there is a economist who he's in the book, and I've been in touch with. But like, if we had acknowledged this $3 trillion force, we would have seen that actually that's what really kept us out of a recession. So, it stands all the reason to have invested in it, but we just don't look at it through those lenses.
Yes, yes, that's so true. So we started to get into this because that's where my brain goes, in your book, that there's a clear and obvious link between the availability of family-friendly government policies in a country and the level of happiness. You even talk about the link to a sense of having a more meaningful life, which who doesn't want that? Who doesn't want to feel that sense of, continuously acquiring a more meaningful life? So let's talk about the link between these things. In your work, talk about what you have learned are the most important policies for care and caregiving. And while I have thoughts on this, why do you think the obvious policy answers in bills or legislation aren't passing?
Right. So the research you referenced originally about the link between parental happiness, and then there's other research suggesting caregiver happiness overall is linked to how robust the support system is and the infrastructure in that country. That comes from Jennifer Glass at University of Texas, Austin. And I think when I was becoming a parent, there was a lot of conversation of, do kids make you happy or unhappy? As if there's an easy answer to that. And when you go digging in the research, I hope that this will not surprise anyone. There's not one definitive study that can tell you whether or not kids will make you happy or unhappy. What they do know is what factors can increase the likelihood of it being a positive experience. And those are when you live in a society with a safety net and support for caregivers. So you can free up so the practical bandwidth of care is not so overwhelming that you actually are able to open yourself up to the emotional riches in it and to the possibility for personal growth and even of spiritual experience in the relationship. But again, if you're overwhelmed by the practical demands, like, you're not getting there. So you see it in countries with, and I'm sure I'm not alone on this call, like just to feel like we've had to say all these things over and over again for decades. I'm myself probably I'm only 12 years into it, and it's still that we need paid leave. We need a childcare system that is affordable. I don't have personally one specific policy that I recommend, but I really believe that we need a policy that's flexible and meets families where they're at, because I know my priorities, desires, needs, all three really shifted a lot over the last 12 years since I had kids. And it wasn't like a one size fits all policy would have worked for me. And I know I'm not alone in that. And the same with elder care. I mean, it's, and starting with it shouldn't have to make you broke to care for a parent that you love. As to why we don't have that, I will leave it to you and others to talk about, the kind of deep policy side of that. But for me, what I was really excited to explore is the cultural piece of that in this book. And I dug in to evolution. And I dug into philosophy, and I dug into theology. And boy, are there blind spots towards care in all of those. And let's start with Darwin. my quick take on evolution from probably, I don't know, maybe even high school, maybe one college level class, but certainly high school, is survival of the fittest, right? That's all kind of what we think, like, oh, humans are competitive species and we survive because we compete. No, like it turns out Darwin was equally committed to something he called sympathy, but we very well today could call care when you read his description of it, as being equally important to the survival of the species.
Yeah.
That we thrive because we care. We look at Western philosophy. We see until basically 1980s for there to be an acknowledgement of dependency.
Mm.
Um, that humans, there's this kind of imagined human in the eyes of philosophers was always independent, equally abled people figuring out how to do right by each other. And then you had this whole amazing movement called care ethicists come into the picture and say, like, wait a minute, humans aren't actually all independent. Some depend on others. And then on top of it, when you're depended on by someone else, you yourself are not really independent anymore because you can't just do whatever you want. Like you have a kid or you have a parent, or you're someone sick in your life. So they started thinking about, what does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to do right by others and to live justly in this world with care in mind?
Mm.
And in the same I've seen in the realm of theology, there's some of my favorite Christian theologians I spoke to through the book talked about how, if you go out of your home and you volunteer to care for the poor and the needy outside the house for someone else, maybe an orphanage, you yourself are venerated. Maybe you're even a saint. But if you care for the poor and needy in your home, like no one's paying attention to you. And worst of all, for me, no one's asking you about your spiritual insights from doing that work. So I saw how deeply, deeply woven into the fabric of our whole society this blind spot to care is. And, I hope that by trying to lift up all these voices in all these realms of whether they're evolutionary scientists, philosophers, psychologists, theologians, trying to put care into the center of the human story can feed this policy fight. Maybe someone's going to go to church on Sunday and the person giving the sermon is going to give it from the perspective of a caregiver. And maybe that's going to help move us forward. And so that's my contribution here and my dream of really getting it right in the part of the human story, which is the center of the human story where it belongs.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I do think that, the thing about books like yours and the thing about telling stories is that it helps connect our real experiences. There is the part of caregiving that feels so isolating because it happens behind closed doors. And those challenges and joys feel like it's just you, or it's your fault, or you and your family did something wrong. You should have worked harder and gotten 3 master's degrees and done all of the things. And so the idea of really elevating the stories that make up the moral fabric of our country is so important. It's so important in just being able to see. There's so many times that, a light bulb has gone off in my head because I see myself in someone else's story, and it kind of just lights up. And the more we do that, I think the more we continue to create a movement that is both deeply interconnected and is communal and is relational and becomes an incredible, care force and an incredible power block to really create the tipping point for the policies that we need. Elissa, we talk to at Family Values at Work, we talk to caregivers all the time. And the things that we hear about, you know, if we're talking about reproductive justice, it should also mean that choosing to have a child shouldn't bankrupt me, that the cost of childcare shouldn't be what it is. And I know we hear all the time this sort of like absurd response that if you can't afford to have a child, don't have a child. And yet we're also very clear that the cost of care on either end of the spectrum, whether it's childcare or elder care or the care of someone with a disability, like folks are literally one emergency away, one insurance denial away, one paycheck away from an incredible level of economic stability, and care shouldn't cost that, right? Like care shouldn't cost that on childcare and on elder care. So we always hear about how care needs to be more affordable, and of course not on the backs of care workers because they also need to have a level of economic mobility.
Yep.
We hear about childcare being unaffordable and families having to make really hard choices about quality of childcare because they're making decisions based on what they can afford. And the same with long-term care and home and community-based services. And we also hear from people that we know as a fact that to be in this country, you have to work. You have to work to make ends meet. There's a very small percentage of people in this country who, to make ends meet and to live, let alone to thrive, let alone to care, don't have to work. So if all of us have to work, then work should work for all of us.
Yes.
And for many people, that means being able to take time off from work for care, whether it's care for themselves, care for chosen family, care for a child. And people are so, this assumption that, folks have parental leave and that's it. Well, when that child is 6, that parental leave no longer covers your time
Right.
to take care of that child. And so all of these things around parental leave and paid family and medical leave, around quality and affordable childcare, around quality and affordable home and community-based services, and the workforce that is needed, that should be supported, that should be able to economically engage in their communities, and have adequate pay. Like those are the things that we hear when people are saying it shouldn't feel like this. It shouldn't take this. And Elissa, I'm from an immigrant community, and the amount of mothers I know who have to send their young children home because they can't afford childcare, because they can't afford to stop working, those are heartbreaking decisions for
Yeah.
a large population of our country. And so we have to do something different with policy. We have to do something different with how our culture is postured around care. And your book is such a great invitation into all of that, that so seamlessly weaves these like data and facts that, as a policy nerd, I love, but seamlessly weaving it in and connecting it with stories, connecting it with what needs to change around our culture. So I'm so grateful for that, aspect of like having that full and comprehensive story.
Thank you.
I have one more question for you before we jump into questions that are in the Q&A, which we've gotten to some, but there's a couple I want to get to. Okay, you talked about Rich. First of all, the stories in this book are, they're like some ugly cry moments over a book, and they're just such like some joyful moments. There's so many people in the book that I want to meet, and the stories are just so beautiful. And there's one that really stands out to me, where you talk about how today's men are doing more care than men have ever done in centuries, and by some measures ever in history. And we know that it's not by any level equitable or sort of, decreasing this care gap. I'm curious what you think has caused this shift. And I'm particularly thinking about the story of David in your book, who to me is like this prototype that invites us to imagine masculinity and the role of care just so, so differently.
Yeah. So right, men, they're not doing enough, but they're doing way more. They're doing way more than their dads did, and they're doing way more than their grandpas did. And it would be really nice if I could sit here and say they're doing more because they wanted to help out, the woman in their lives. Not the case. Women went to work out of sometimes desire, sometimes necessity, and someone had to step up. I don't want to make men sound terrible and selfish in this equation. Care is you pay a social cost for care. It's feminized work, which means it's devalued work. We still see that today with men and workplaces and care, that we talk about the motherhood penalty and the fatherhood bonus, but that's only real if the father doesn't try to bring his active caregiving self into the workplace. The second the father starts acting like a mother and admitting that there's a small human that needs to go to the pediatrician, or a parent that needs to go to the doctor, he's getting that penalty too. So men have been doing this care, and for them, it's been a way to kind of break free from the constraints they experience in the patriarchy. You know, as bell hooks and others have written about, like, the patriarchy is not just bad for women, it's bad for men too. It locks them into this kind of rigid version of what it means to be a man, in which being vulnerable or acknowledging, let alone accepting, the reality of human dependency is not tolerated. And so you refer to the story of David Pullman, whose story just so perfectly embodied this in a way that, sometimes I'm like, you're real, right? Am I dreaming this? He grew up on an army base with what the father you might imagine him having had, a tough love, zero vulnerability dad. And at a young age, David realized he could never do right by his dad, so he might as well do wrong by his dad. And thus began, decades of rebellion involving drugs and violent crime. David ended up in prison. After it took David a long time in prison to really feel like he wanted to get out, to actually see that there was a different way to live that felt organic and intuitive for him. Eventually gets out of prison. He reconnects with a woman he knew as a child, and they have a daughter together. And through having this daughter, David accesses a part of himself that he never did before, which is a self that's able to talk about his emotions, a self that's able to ask other people about their emotions, because I don't want to diss on men, but I'll just say I dated some guys who were good about talking they could get to the part where they talked about their own feelings, but the whole thing of asking others about their feelings was the next step. So, right, not only was he aware of his emotional self, he was aware that others have their own emotional selves and want to be invested in them. Having this daughter opened him up to just this whole other way to live life overall, and to be in these networks of dependency, and to see what it feels like to be in care. Care as a relationship, care as a state of being, care as a kind of lens through which you live your life. And it changed his life. I mean, his life's still hard. The mother of his child died, and a couple years ago, so about a year after I spoke to him while writing this book. And if we think it's hard for single moms, it's even harder for single dads. And I've tried helping him, and I couldn't find anything either. And I kind of do research for a living in Colorado to find any kind of real support system or safety net for single dads seems to be almost non-existent. So it's not a happily ever after stories. A lot of people in my book who had these care epiphanies or had a really meaningful experiences through care didn't necessarily live happily ever after stories, such as life, but opened up a part of themselves that they may not have been able to access, and really gave them a whole new way to experience the world.
I love that. It was absolutely one of my favorite stories in the books. I could imagine it all playing out. I want to turn to the Q&A section. Some of it is just comments. I think there's a comment that said, I saw a recent message that said, always helping people says more about your needs than theirs. It seemed to be diminishing care or down, putting the act of helping. And this person says they've been sitting with that. I wonder if you have any quick reflections on that.
Yeah, so I actually wrote a story that really kind of takes that on, called The Myth of Codependency. It published in The Atlantic a couple months ago now. But I think, and I don't know if a woman suggested that. I think women, for so long, it was expected that women would be endlessly giving and selfless. That now, especially in kind of online therapy culture on Instagram and TikTok, there's a lot about putting, we need to put these boundaries up. And codependency, which started as a movement in the addiction circles, now has become a word, is kind of like waving the red flag. Like if you're too invested in others' feelings, or you're too invested how others might feel about you, you're red flag codependent. And I think we need to take it a step further, because we absolutely should be mindful of our boundaries and not always jump to help because we're women and we were raised to be nurturers. But at the same time, I, for one, am not going to diminish my nurturing side. It's something that gives me pleasure and also, again, like provokes me and inspires me in so many ways. So I'm hoping, this is what, if there are still waves of feminism, this is where we're at. We can raise up that nurturing side without letting that nurturing side hold us back, and get men to come in, come on in. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I could see how it's potentially diminishing, it could potentially be diminishing care. I do think there's a warning in here about assumptions of ableism that we can sometimes carry into care. And so there is something about that. And we know that particularly, we are living in an ableist society, and we have to be incredibly mindful of that not everyone, we perceive as needing care needs the type of care we might want to offer.
Yeah.
And that concept has to really be built into how we think about care, the idea of a level of agency, the idea of a level of consent, the idea of a level of relational agreements, even in a care and caregiving situation. And I believe that to be true of how we see children, and true of how we see people with disabilities, and true of how we see people, elders among us that might need care. The idea that children don't have agency and are therefore, shouldn't understand or give consent, or just this concept that can sometimes be so centered in ableism around care, I think is a trap that we have to be really mindful of in our country.
Yeah, I just want to give a quick plug for philosopher Nell Noddings, who I write about in the book, and how for her, she really thought deeply of what does it mean to give good care, and receptivity is right at the top, right? You don't give people what you think they need, give them what they seem to need by your trying really hard to understand what that is. And I think that's an important, once we make care bigger, we can insert that into the narrative. Like giving good care is tough.
Okay, so one last question before I call Marjorie back to sort of close us out. Um, there's a question that says, do you vision the sense of community and communal care as an aid to our current care dynamics?
Say it one more time. It's like,
Do you vision the sense of community and communal care as an aid to our current care dynamics?
yeah. So if I'm understanding correctly, and apologize if I'm not, I think that what we forget about care, and there is a cultural piece in the States too, that's part of the fix to the care crisis, of really seeing ourselves in communities of care, and seeing care as not just a dyad, but kind of this like Russian nesting dolls of care. I mentioned it earlier, but not only like when you care for someone, they're clearly dependent on you, but no, you're not independent anymore. You have someone caring on you. So the caregivers need care. And I've had people, and I'm talking about my book, ask me, I'm not a mom, or I'm not a dad, and I also don't have anyone else I'm caring for. Like, how can I be part of this? And I was like, it's care for the caregivers. Like we all have to be caring for the caregivers. And I think there is something we can do in the here and now, still fighting for those policies that are so necessary, but to really be inspired by some communities in our country, and particularly certain immigrant communities that do have this like great kin network culture, and try to build those in our lives. And that for me personally was one of the good things to come out of the pandemic. Of we didn't have an official pod, but forming these kind of informal, really thick networks with other families where now there's just we have this open door policy with 2 other families. Like, you need somewhere to drop your kids, they're always welcome here, and vice versa. So, right, it's get out of that dyad sense of one-on-one with care, and really it's concentric circles of care that we're all living in.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I will go even a step further to say that there's a sense of communal care that will never be replaced, even by perfect policy, even by the most perfect infrastructure. So I do see communal care and community care as an aid to our current care dynamics. I think it's, it's critically important. Like you said, Elissa, if you need someone in a drop of a dime to watch your children, you're not going to, and you can't wait for a babysitter, that community care is where that becomes an aid and a supplement to all of this. Oh my gosh, we could talk for hours. I have 50 more questions that I'm so excited about for this book. My book is all like underlined and highlighted in 3 different colors for different reasons because I'm that person.
I love it. Yeah.
But I really hope that folks pick up this book, When You Care, The Unexpected Magic, which, magic just feels like such an amazing word of caring for others. I'm going to invite Marjorie back to sort of close us out. Elissa, thank you so much. I can't wait to try to catch you in person on your tour. And I'll be tracking that as well.
Thank you so much, Josie. This was great.
Absolutely. Thank you, Josie. It was a wonderful conversation. And so, as we said, timely and important conversation. And when we wanted to do this book talk with Elissa, we thought about the perfect person that could be her moderator and facilitate this conversation. You were at the top of that list. So thank you so much for agreeing to, host this conversation with Elissa. And Elissa, what a beautiful book. It's beautifully titled, as Josie shared. And I appreciate the work that you're doing to lift up these issues and your commitment to care. Really important. And also, I just wanted to thank Brendan Creamer, who is our comms officer at the Aspen team. He has helped conceptualize the book talk as well as coordinated all of this work. So thank you, Brendan, for that. And thank you for all of those that joined and, put comments in the chat. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I hope that you continue it by reading the book and sharing it with your colleagues and your friends and your family. And be blessed in your caregiving. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.